Hi, if you are watching, this is the May lesson, number 2, for the story Dragon Dragon by John Gardner, 1962. And I'm just going to start with the story. So you should have the link and we'll just get started. There once was a king whose kingdom was plagued by a dragon. The king did not know which way to turn. The king's knights were all cowards who hid under their beds whenever the dragon came in sight, so they were of no use to the king at all. And the king's wizard could not help either, because being old, he'd forgotten his magic spells. Nor could the wizard look up the spells that had slipped his mind, for he had unfortunately misplaced his wizard's book many years before. The king was at his wit's end. Every time there was a full moon, the dragon came out of his lair and ravaged the countryside. He frightened maidens, stopped up chimneys, broke store windows, set people's clocks back, made dogs bark until no one could hear himself think, tipped over fences, robbed graves, put frogs in people's drinking water, tore the last chapters out of novels, changed house numbers around so people crawled into bed with their neighbors. He stole spark plugs out of people's cars and put firecrackers in people's cigars, and stole the clappers from all the church bells, and sprung every bear trap for miles around so the bears could wander wherever they pleased. And to top it all off, he changed around all the roads in the kingdom so that people could not get anywhere except by starting out in the wrong direction. Okay, so I'm going to stop the story right here. I'm going to point out the author's use of 3 literary devices. A literary device is simply any technique an author uses to convey a deeper meaning or elevate a story to a higher level. This is ridiculous. This is humor. It doesn't take itself, the story doesn't take itself seriously. The tone is irreverent, silly. Come on, they didn't have spark plugs in medieval times with dragons, right? Okay, but I'm going to tell you why the author uses humor. This is actually a really serious topic today. And the topic today is on giving advice or receiving advice. So advice is giving someone a recommendation of what must be done. Counsel, guidance, suggestions, instructions. A great title for your essay would be Wise Suggestions. Just a thought. Wise means having or showing experience, knowledge, or good judgment. So someone who's wise is shrewd, intelligent, insightful, and learned, which is why we listen to them when they give us advice. Okay, so the second device is going to be repetition. You all know this one. Repeating something over and over adds emphasis, draws attention, and because it's important. And the third literary device is the rule of 3. Which ironically, I use in every outline, pretty much. This is an anthropological, statistically proven strategy. Readers better understand concepts, situations, or ideas in groups of 3. So what do we do in our essays? We group topics in 3s. We make 3 points and we back up each of those 3 points because it works. Okay, so let me go ahead and read the rest of the story, and you're going to look out for some advice. Now, you're about to be introduced to the cobbler, who's the dad, and he has 3 sons. And I want you to think about the advice the cobbler gives to his 3 sons. Is it good advice? Is it silly? Is it ridiculous? Okay, here we go. That, said the king in a fury, is enough. And he called a meeting of everyone in the kingdom. Now it happened that there lived in the kingdom a wise old cobbler who had a wife and 3 sons. 3. The cobbler and his family came to the king's meeting and stood way in back by the door, for the cobbler had a feeling that since he was nobody important, there'd probably been some mistake. And no doubt the king had intended the meeting for everyone in the kingdom except his family and him. And that's, again, silly and ridiculous. Ladies and gentlemen, said the king when everyone was present, I've put up with that dragon as long as I can. He has got to be stopped. All the people whispered among themselves, and the king smiled, pleased with the impression he had made. Just a little bit here. Here we go. But the wise cobbler said gloomily, it's all very well to talk about it, But how are you going to do it? And now all the people smiled and winked as if to say, well, King, he's got you there. The king frowned. It's not that His Majesty hasn't tried, the queen spoke up loudly from a page. Yes, said the king, I've told my knights again and again that they ought to slay the dragon, but I can't force them to go. I'm not a tyrant. Why doesn't the wizard say a magic spell? Asked the cobbler. He's done the best he can, said the king. The wizard blushed and everyone looked embarrassed. I used to do all sorts of spells and chants when I was younger, the wizard explained, but I've lost my spell book and I begin to fear I'm losing my memory too. For instance, I've been trying for days to recall one spell I used to do. I forget just now what the deuce it was for. It went something like bimble wimble cha-cha chum. Suddenly, to everyone's surprise, the queen turned into a rose bush. Again, humor. Oh dear, said the wizard. Now you've done it, groaned the king. Poor mother, said the princess. I don't know what could have happened, the wizard said nervously, but don't worry, I'll have her back in a jiffy. He shut his eyes and racked his brain for a spell that would change her back, but the king said quickly, you'd better leave well enough alone. If you change her into a rattlesnake, we'll have to chop off her head. Meanwhile, the cobbler stood with his hands in his pockets, sighing at the waste of time. About the dragon, he began. Oh, yes, said the king. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give the princess's hand in marriage to anyone who can make the dragon stop. It's not enough, said the cobbler. She's a nice enough girl, you understand, but how would an ordinary person support her? Also, what about those of us that are already married? In that case, said the king, I'll offer the princess's hand or half the kingdom or both, whichever is most convenient. The cobbler scratched his chin, considered it. It's not enough, he said at last. It's a good enough kingdom, you understand, but it's too much responsibility. Take it or leave it, the king said. I'll leave it, said the cobbler, and he shrugged and went home. But the cobbler's eldest son thought that the bargain was a good one, for the princess was very beautiful, and he liked the idea of having half the kingdom to run as he pleased. So he said to the king, I'll accept those terms, your majesty. By tomorrow morning, the dragon will be slain. Bless you, cried the king. Hooray, 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 cried all the people, throwing their hats in the air. The cobbler's eldest son beamed with pride, and the second eldest looked at him enviously. The youngest said timidly, excuse me, your majesty, but don't you think the queen looks a little unwell? If I were you, I think I'd water her. Good heavens, cried the king, glancing at the queen who'd been changed into a rosebush. I'm glad you mentioned it. Now, the cobbler's eldest son was very clever, was known far and wide for how quickly he could multiply fractions in his head. He was perfectly sure he could slay the dragon by somehow or other playing a trick on him. And he didn't feel that he needed his wise old father's advice. But he thought it was only polite to ask. And so he went to his father, who was working as usual at his cobbler's bench, and said, well, father, I'm off to slay the dragon. Have you any advice to give me? The cobbler thought a moment and replied, when and if you come to the dragon's lair, recite the following poem. Dragon, dragon, how do you do? I've come from the king to murder you. Say it very loudly and firmly, and the dragon will fall, God willing, at your feet. Now, is that good advice? Kind of seems not good advice or ridiculous. So you're going to see here 3 sons, the same advice given 3 times, rule of 3. Okay. How curious, said the eldest son. And he thought to himself, the old man is not as wise as I thought. If I say something like that to the dragon, he will eat me up in an instant. The way to kill a dragon is to outfox him. And keeping his opinion to himself, the eldest son set forth on his quest. When he came at last to the dragon's lair, which was a cave, the eldest son slyly disguised himself as a peddler, knocked on the door and called out, hello there. There's nobody home, roared a voice. The voice was as loud as an earthquake, and the eldest son's knees knocked together in terror. I don't come to trouble you, the eldest son said meekly. I merely thought you might be interested in looking at some of our brushes, or if you'd prefer, he added quickly, I could leave our catalog with you and I could drop by again, say early next week. I don't want any brushes, the voice roared, and I especially don't want any brushes next week. Oh, said the eldest son. Excuse me, but now his knees were knocking together so badly he had to sit down. Suddenly, a great shadow fell over him. The eldest son looked up. It was the dragon. The eldest son drew his sword, but the dragon lunged and swallowed him in a single gulp, sword and all. And the eldest son found himself in the dark of the dragon's belly. Now, this is silly. You would think he's eaten by the dragon. He's alive and well inside the dragon's stomach. What a fool I was not to listen to my wise old father, thought the eldest son, and he began to weep bitterly. Remember that quote. He's going to say it. There's going to be repetition again. Well, sighed the king the next morning, I see the dragon has not yet been slain yet. I'm just as glad, personally, said the princess, sprinkling the queen. I would have had to marry that eldest son, and he had warts. Now, the cobbler's middle son decided it was his turn to try. The middle son was very strong and was known far and wide for being able to lift up the corner of a church. He felt perfectly sure he could slay the dragon by simply laying into him. But he thought it would be only polite to ask his father's advice. So he went to his father and said to him, Well, father, I'm off to slay the dragon. Have you any advice for me? The cobbler told the middle son exactly what he told the eldest. Here's some repetition. When and if you come to the dragon's lair, recite the following poem. Dragon, dragon, how do you do? I've come from the king to murder you. Say it very loudly and firmly, and the dragon will fall, God willing, at your feet. What an odd thing to say, thought the middle son. The old man is not as wise as I thought. You have to take these dragons by surprise. But he kept his opinion to himself and set forth. When he came in sight of the dragon's lair, the middle son spurred his horse to a gallop and thundered into the entrance, swinging his sword with all his might. But the dragon had seen him while he was still a long way off, and being very clever, the dragon had crawled up on top of the door so that when the sun came charging in, he went under the dragon and onto the back of the cave and slammed into the wall. Then the dragon chuckled, got down off the door, taking his time, strolled back to where the man and the horse lay unconscious from the terrific blow. Opening his mouth as if for a yawn, the dragon swallowed the middle son in a single gulp. Put the horse in the freezer to eat another day. What a fool I was not to listen to my wise old father, thought the middle son when he came to in the dragon's belly, and he too began to weep bitterly. All right, little repetition here. That night there was a full moon. The dragon ravaged the countryside so terribly, several families moved to another kingdom. Well, sighed the king in the morning, still no luck in this dragon business, I see. I'm just as glad myself, said the princess, moving her mother pot and all to the window where the sun could get at her. The cobbler's middle son was kind of a humpback. Now the cobbler's youngest son saw that his turn had come. He was very upset and nervous, and he wished he'd never been born. He was not clever like the eldest brother, and he was not strong like his second eldest brother. He was a decent, honest boy who always minded his elders. He's kind of a nerd. He borrowed a suit of armor from a friend of his who was a knight, and when the youngest son put the armor on, it was so heavy he could hardly walk. From another knight, he borrowed a sword, and that was so heavy, the only way the youngest son could get it to the dragon's lair was to drag it along behind his horse like a plow. When everything was in readiness, the youngest son went for a last conversation with his father. What do you think his father's advice is going to be? Rule of 3, repetition. Father, have you any advice to give me? He said. Only this, said the cobbler. When and if you come to the dragon's lair, recite the following poem. Dragon, dragon, how do you do? I've come from the king to murder you. Say it very loudly and firmly, and the dragon will fall, God willing, at your feet. Are you certain? Asked the youngest son uneasily. Excuse me. As certain as one can ever be in these matters, said the wise old cobbler. And so the youngest son set forth on his quest. He traveled over hill and dale and at last came to the dragon's cave. The dragon who'd seen the cobbler's youngest son while he was still a long way off was seated up above the door inside the cave, waiting and smiling to himself. But minutes passed and no one came thundering in. The dragon frowned, puzzled, and was tempted to peek out. However, reflecting that patience seldom goes unrewarded, the dragon kept his head up and out of sight and went on waiting. At last, when he could stand it no longer, the dragon craned his neck and looked. There at the entrance of the cave stood a trembling young man in a suit of armor twice his size, struggling with his sword so heavy he could lift only one end of it at a time. At sight of the dragon, the cobbler's youngest son began to tremble so violently that his armor rattled like a house caving in. He heaved with all his might at the sword and got the handle up level with his chest. But even now the point was down in the dirt. As loudly and firmly as he could manage, the youngest son cried, Dragon, dragon, how do you do? I've come from the king to murder you. What? Cried the dragon, flabbergasted. You murder me. All at once he began to laugh, pointing at the little cobbler's son. He roared, shaking all over, and tears filled his eyes. Laughed the dragon. Okay, it's not a great laugh. He was laughing so hard he had to hang on to his sides, and he fell off the door and landed on his back, still laughing, kicking his legs helplessly, rolling from side to side, laughing and laughing and laughing. Repetition. The cobbler's son was annoyed. I do come from the king to murder you, he said. A person doesn't like to be laughed at for a thing like that. Wailed the dragon, almost sobbing, gasping for breath. Of course not, poor dear boy, but really, the idea of it, and that simply ridiculous poem. Tears streamed from the dragon's eyes, and he lay on his back, perfectly helpless with laughter. It's a good poem, said the cobbler's youngest son loyally. My father made it up. And growing angrier, he shouted, I want you to stop that laughing, or I'll. But the dragon could not stop for the life of him, and suddenly, in a terrific rage, the cobbler's son began flopping the sword end over end in the direction of the dragon. Sweat ran off the youngest son's forehead, but he labored on, blistering mad, and at last, with one supreme heave, he had the sword standing on its handle a foot from the dragon's throat. Of its own weight, the sword fell, slicing the dragon's head off. Hee-haw! Went the dragon, and then he lay dead. The two older brothers, crawled out. Well, that's ridiculous. And thanked their younger brother for saving their lives. We have learned our lesson, they said. Then the three brothers gathered all the treasures from the dragon's cave, tied them to the back end of the youngest brother's horse, and tied the dragon's head on behind the treasures and started home. I'm glad I listened to my father, the youngest son thought. Now I'll be the richest man in the kingdom. There were hand-carved picture frames and silver spoons and boxes of jewels and chests of money and silver compasses and maps telling where there were more treasures buried when these ran out. There was also a curious old book with a picture of an owl on the cover, and inside poems and odd sentences and recipes that seemed to make no sense. The spell book. When they reached the king's castle, and the people all leapt for joy to see that the dragon was dead, and the princess ran out and kissed the youngest brother on the forehead, for secretly she had hoped it would be him. Well, said the king, which half of the kingdom do you want? My wizard's book, exclaimed the wizard. He's found my wizard's book. He opened the book, ran his finger along under the words, and then said in a loud voice, glumsk, sklumps, blam. Instantly, the queen stood before them in her natural shape, except she was soaking wet from being sprinkled too often. She glared at the king. Oh dear, said the king, hurrying to the door. Okay, so just once again, it's a lot of silliness. Okay, but I think that works. The humor, the ridiculousness worked. Because let's talk about what this was really about. This is the author really talking about what happens when you don't heed the advice. You don't listen to the advice of someone older. So we're going to go ahead and go to your outline. And notice the lead in the short story, Dragon, Dragon. A king addresses citizens in his kingdom, explaining how he's fed up with the kingdom. This is a summary of the story. What we're going to do is we're going to make an application today. Just like in the story, it's wise to follow the advice of older, more experienced individuals, both at home and at school. So that's kind of your frame of reference. And whose advice do you follow at home? Well, obviously mom and dad, maybe grandparents, an aunt or an uncle. Could be an older sibling. I know what you're saying. We fight a lot. We don't get along. I'm the youngest of four. There were 4 siblings in my house. I get it. But I did learn, being the youngest of 4, from my older siblings, and they did give me good advice, right? So my older sibling gave advice, don't compare yourself to someone else. That's really good advice. And isn't that what we do in our culture, social media? You probably go to school and you compare what you have to maybe what somebody else is wearing. Oh, those are cool shoes, right? Maybe they're technology, maybe where they live, and your parents are doing the same things. That's what we do. We compare. Maybe you compare grades, right? Friend groups. And then if I didn't follow my sister's advice and kept comparing myself, I would just lose confidence. I'd start feeling depressed. Maybe just start isolating myself and not want to be around other people, feeling like I don't measure up. That's just good advice for anybody. A mom might give really good advice, such as get to sleep. Sleep is your best friend. Make sure you get plenty of sleep. And kids kind of stay up late, maybe phone, YouTube videos.
for whatever reason. Sleep is your best friend. So here's what happens when you don't listen to mom and stay up late. You are cranky and moody the next day. The odds are pretty good you're not thinking very clearly. How can you? It's pretty scientifically proven that you are more likely to grab something unhealthy to eat when you're tired. And you're also more likely to not exercise when you're tired. So it's kind of and obviously your mood's going to suffer. So when you don't get enough sleep, that's just the worst thing that can happen. And that's good advice a mom might give you, right? A dad might give you advice, stay off your technology, use it for school, have a limit, but go outside and play with friends. Go enjoy the outside. And if you didn't, and you got stuck inside all day, you'd miss out on maybe some fun things with friends, playing games, playing sports, just talking with them, hanging out with them. Not to mention what your body needs: sunshine. It's vitamin D from the sun. It needs that. And that fresh air stimulates you mentally as well as physically and socially. Win, win, win. So here's what you're going to do in body one. At home, this is a cause and effect essay. So notice the sentence shows cause and effect. At home, parents and older siblings know what they're talking about. And when they suggest solutions for children who live with them, and kids choose not to listen, this is when they will face problems. So you get to choose your topics. And I kind of went over them with you. A dad might suggest to their child, stay off technology, right? A mom might warn a child not to stay up late. An older sibling explains to their younger sibling, it's really important not to compare yourself to others. You can choose any topics you want, but make sure they are relatable. So it's important for children to follow the wise counsel of those in their household who are older and wiser than them. And if they don't, they will regret their actions. Moms and dads, I know you don't always want to listen to them, but we do know what we're talking about. Let's go to school. And I think the second body paragraph is going to be easier. Students are often offered recommendations from staff members, administrators, teachers, coaches. When they ignore their judgment, children find themselves in trouble. Let me give you an example. And I put the principal. I don't even like that example. Say a librarian banned a book. There's a reason the librarian banned the book. It's too mature of content. It's inappropriate. Maybe it's violent. If a child, let me tell you, if they ban a book, most kids want to go get the banned book. That's how kids are. Oh, forbidden fruit. But if that child or younger student reads a book that's too high or exposes them to information they're not ready for, they could have nightmares. It could put really bad ideas in their head that they're not ready for. A teacher, here's an easy one. Do your homework. Complete it on time. Don't procrastinate. Really good advice. And I think you all know that, because if you don't follow that advice, if a kid doesn't follow that advice, let's say, for example, it's your teacher gave you 3 weeks for a group project. It's tonight. It's due tomorrow. You've had 3 weeks to do it, but you waited until the night before. You're probably going to rush to get it done, and you'll get something done. It will not be a quality job. It will look rushed. It will look sloppy, and you won't be proud of it. That's what happens when we procrastinate. But how many times do kids do that? I know, because I have kids send in essays. I just had one today. His class is at 4:30. It's now 4:11. He turned it in 30 minutes ago and expects me to have it done. Yeah. The coach, a coach is going to say, hey, let's say it's a basketball coach, practice your shots at home, practice your dribbling at home. Not just, we can only practice so often. If all the other players on your team are practicing, it's going to show. They're going to make shots. If you don't practice, you're not going to be put in the game. Not for very long. You're going to be benched. You're going to let your team down. You're going to let yourself down. And I think that's true for a music teacher. If you don't practice your instrument, you're not going to get good at it. So most students at school who refuse to follow instructions from professional staff members regret their decisions. So you're going to show cause and effect. Your thesis shows cause and effect. Your topic and end sentence show cause and effect. Make sure your points, your 3 points, remember the rule of 3, show cause and effect. No, you don't have to use my examples. You can use anything you want as long as it fits a wise person in your household, a wise person at your school. And I'm not talking friends, we're talking adults. Okay. So whether it's at home or school, when children refuse to heed the advice given to them by those whom they should trust, they find they wish they had listened. So the overall theme or message intended by John Gardner in his short story Dragon Dragon has real life applications today. It would appear children in any time period behave the same way as the 3 siblings in the story. Their father, the cobbler, was seen as a wise man by the king who listened to his suggestions. However, even the eldest son asked for his father's advice, but he thought he really didn't listen to his father's advice. Same thing with the middle son. And both the eldest and middle son said from the dragon's belly, "What a fool I was not to listen to my wise old father." And that's how I know the theme. And it was repeated, emphasis. So the lesson to be learned is to follow the sage advice of someone who's older. They likely know what they're talking about. So I will leave you with this. Be careful, that word advice. You're going to want to repeat advice, advice, advice. So look up the synonyms, and I think I provided them for you. Pretty sure I did. And be careful with that. And just have a little fun with it. There are 2 example paragraphs, just to give you an idea how to do that. I actually had my employee write the second one just to give you different perspective. Okay, this concludes lesson 2. Thank you for watching. Please submit your essay as soon as possible since you're already behind if you're watching this, because I've already taught. I don't do the video until I teach the entire lesson. Okay, thanks.